Life can be weird sometimes, taking you places you never thought you would go and connecting you with people you never thought you would see again. Several months ago, I moved to a new town that is about an hour away from the town I grew up in. I moved into a beautiful home that rested within a quiet suburban community, the opposite of the neighborhood I grew up in. The most peculiar and, quite frankly, the most amazing thing about my new home was the fact that I knew my neighbor. It was my old childhood friend, Artie. If I had made a list of people I was sure that I would never see again, Artie would be top of that list. Growing up, we kids in the neighborhood always get together and played sports, played tag, rode bikes, and basically just acted like degenerate youths. Of all the kids in my neighborhood, Artie was one of my best friends. When we were kids, video games were just starting to get popular, not like they are today. Artie and I were the only two that loved video games and spent more time than anybody else sitting inside and playing them. We'd still play outside with everybody else, but we were more invested in our video games. I even remember specifically many times when Artie would stay overnight and we'd play games all night long. Sadly, when I was in 5th grade, Artie and his family moved away. We called each other a few times, but we lost touch and never reconnected. When MySpace first came out, we became friends on that platform, but he was living his own life somewhere else, and it just seemed like we had nothing in common anymore. By the time Facebook came around, I had all but forgotten about Artie and never even thought to look him up. Artie was no more than a distant memory, and that was until I moved into my new home, and I was beyond shocked to find out that my neighbor was actually him. At first, it was amazing to see my old friend. We connected right away, and I was in shock that he lived back on this side of the United States. When we were kids, they moved to the East Coast. It was just very surprising that he now lived so close to where we grew up. I asked him what brought him back to this part of the country, and he simply just said that he liked the West Coast more. After I got moved in, I invited Artie over for a couple of beers to catch up. When he showed up that night, he came with 2 of his friends, a man named Scott and Scott's girlfriend. Her name was Jane. I thought it was a little rude that Artie showed up with people without asking me first. I didn't care and would have been okay with it, it's just really the principle of the matter. The 3 of them started acting weird as soon as they were inside. Scott and Jane were fascinated with all my stuff in my living room. Their eyes were zooming around my house, and they looked like they weren't even on the same planet as me. It was like they were taking a mental inventory of everything in my home. Every few minutes, I would notice Scott and Jane whispering to each other. Call me crazy if you will, but I had a bad feeling brewing in my stomach. Eventually, I brought up video games to Artie. I asked if he still played any games. He looked disgusted, and then laughed to himself. In an arrogant and condescending voice, he said, "No way, man. I stopped playing video games when I was like 12. That stuff's for kids." I laughed out of habit and tried to mirror his attitude. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Oh man, I must have missed the memo when I was 12. Not only do I still play, but I actually work on games for a living." Everyone in the room shared a small laugh. It was a burst of awkward laughter, if I'm being honest. I will say, though, after sharing that bit of news, the mood in the room changed quite a bit. They all seemed very interested in what I had to say and specifically what I did. Scott was asking very specific questions like if the computer that I had in the room was the computer I used for work, and it was. I worked at a studio as my main source of income, but I spent a lot of my time working on my home computer, and I'm working on my own indie game on my machine in the spare time. I shared all those details and much more with Artie, Scott, and Jane. We continued to hang out for a little while longer, and then we called it a night. The next day I saw Artie outside, and I waved to him while I was heading to my car to run some errands. He waved, but he looked frustrated about something. That night I stayed in and worked on my game all night. A little after 2 a.m. I got an alert on my phone that someone was at my door. I had a motion camera that was on the side of my front door as well as a Ring camera on the doorbell. I pulled up the video and I couldn't believe my eyes. There were 3 people on my front steps. All 3 were wearing masks and had hoods on. These were the masks that you would wear to the doctors, not like Halloween masks. They looked like they were deliberating about something. 2 of them were standing in the background, and one of them was directly in front of the door. The one in front of the door turned around completely, so his back was facing the camera now. He was concealing something in the back of his waistband. He grabbed the handle of it and then let it go, and from that little action, I was able to tell exactly what he was concealing. Finally, he turned back once again and grabbed the doorknob. He turned the doorknob a few times, testing to see if it was locked, and thank God it was. He took a step back as if he were deciding his next move, and that's when one potential intruder noticed the Ring camera. The person in the back yelled, "Wait," and they pointed to the camera. It was a woman's voice that yelled, "Wait." The intruder in front bent over and stared directly into the camera. Even with the mask on, it was obvious. The intruder directly in front of my camera was Artie, which led me to believe the other two were his friends, Scott and Jane, that I met earlier. His eyes got wide as if he knew that he was caught. Scott and Jane turned and ran in the opposite direction of Artie's house. Artie took a few steps back, then came back to the door and shook the handle aggressively, trying one last time to get inside. He said something under his breath that I couldn't understand, and then he also ran. I called the police, gave them the footage, and reported every detail to them. Artie didn't come home for days, probably because he knew that he was going to get caught. After a couple of days, I finally saw him sneaking into his own house. I called the police, who showed up quickly. It turns out, after I reported Artie to the police, they were able to connect the dots to an entire string of home invasions. The nail in the coffin for Artie and his accomplices was the fact that another house they robbed weeks ago also had a Ring camera, and they weren't wearing masks for that little outing. It was sad to see an old friend fall so far. Someone I had so many fond memories of turned and went down a completely dark path. Thankfully, that motion camera and Ring camera saved my life. Never assume that you're immune from robbery or worse based on where you live. I live in a very safe neighborhood with almost zero crime, and if it were not for my cameras, I may not be sharing this story today. The hardest part of moving to a town for people like me is making friends. Making friends in general is something I struggle with. Unfortunately, I am a bit on the awkward side, and I'm not afraid to admit that. When my job forced me to move hundreds of miles from my hometown, I was sad, but I couldn't pass up the chance. The work I do is important, and it pays very well. My logic was that I would move away, make some money, and then move back to my hometown in a couple of years when my contract was completed. The first month in my new town was tough. After work, I sort of just went home and played video games and watched everything I could, but it was only a matter of time until loneliness crept its ugly head around. I eventually discovered a comic book store that was only about 5 minutes away from my new house. One thing about me is that I love comics. I've been reading Marvel comics since I was old enough to read, and in fact, probably even longer than that. I used to be obsessed with the illustrations in comics before I could even read, and I remember grabbing my brother's comics and just staring at the covers before I could even understand what the words even said. Finding this bookstore wouldn't cure my loneliness, but the comfort of comics would be a nice distraction for me. I started going a couple of times a week and got hooked once again on all my favorite comics. One day, while I was perusing the new comic book section, I grabbed the latest Fantastic Four comic, and right at that moment, I was approached by an interesting-looking man. He was tall and very skinny. He had these thick black glasses and shoulder-length blonde hair. He had a beard, but it wasn't a good one. It was all patchy and all over the place. I moved out of the way thinking that he wanted to get into that section, but instead he wanted to talk to me. In this thick southern accent, he said, "Hey man, you a fan of the Fantastic Four?" I smiled and nodded. I'm not the greatest with random interactions like that. "Dude, you're gonna love it. He really knows how to write the F4. Name's Pete, by the way. Not Peter Parker, though." Then he laughed, as I did too. If anybody doesn't know, Peter Parker is the real name of the man underneath the Spider-Man mask. I looked at Pete and extended my hand and said, "Nice to meet you, Pete." Then I gave him my name. From that strange and very awkward interaction, Pete and I became friends. We hung out several times a week and just talked about comics, Star Wars, video games, and basically anything nerdy that I was interested in. It was like this guy was created in a lab specifically to be my friend. For months this continued, and I was happy with my new friend. One day, when we were leaving the comic book shop, Pete said, I was thinking it was a sign, you moving here and stuff, walking into that shop that day. It's like you're me, but from the multiverse." Which is another comic book reference that Pete pulled out of nowhere. I just laughed and went along with it, and I did that a lot with Pete. Not too much longer after that comment, I noticed that Pete was wearing the same clothes as me. I would wear my Fantastic Four shirt once a week at least, and before I knew it, so did Pete. I would wear a Darth Vader shirt, and then the next day, Pete would have the same one. I'm not saying people can't have the same shirts, it just seemed awfully strange that out of nowhere, he had the same shirts as me. Right around this time, he cuts his hair and shaves his beard, and if you're keeping track at home, I have short hair and I'm clean shaven. When we hung out the day he got his hair cut, he said, "Now we definitely look like we could be the same person. Do you think maybe we actually are? Like, maybe we really are from the multiverse or something?" It didn't seem like one of Pete's comic book references anymore. This seemed weird and just off for some reason. I just dismissed his comment and started talking about food or something. It made me uncomfortable and I just kind of wanted to redirect the conversation. That night I couldn't help but think about it. I may not be articulating it well, but everything about the latest comment was just off. His mannerisms, the way he looked, the way he talked, everything was just different. I thought about texting him that night and telling him that I felt uncomfortable, but I decided that I'm being paranoid and I left it alone. The next day I was getting ready to leave for work, and when I opened the door, I could have sworn that I saw Pete's car, but as I said, I was being paranoid and just ignored my feelings. Pete had texted me to make sure that we were still on for the comic book store after work, and I told him yeah, even though I didn't want to. I worked for a few hours, but I had myself all worked up for some reason. I asked my supervisor if I could leave early because I wasn't feeling well, and she let me go just several hours into my shift. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was that the front door inside the screen door was open. I could never leave that door open. I have thousands of dollars worth of collectibles, comic books, and Funko Pops, and I approached the door slowly and I entered quietly. I could hear movement coming from my office, which is where all those valuables I just mentioned are located. I snuck to the side door and peered inside the room, and in the closet, rummaging through boxes, was Pete. I barged in the room and said, "Pete? What are you doing?" He jumped and started to stutter a little bit. I was just trying to see if you had a certain comic, man. I was going to surprise you." I looked around the room. All the drawers in my desk were open and my computer was open. My social security card was in that desk. To the right of Pete was a box, and inside the box was a handful of my rarest comics, some of them being worth well over $5,000, and some personal financial documents were in the box. "Listen, man, He paused and started to look around the room. What I had just noticed, though, is he wasn't talking with that accent anymore. Before I could process my next thought, Pete grabbed the lamp that was on my desk, ripped it from the wall, and threw it at me as hard as he could. It hit me on the head, and when I bent over in pain, he punched me in the face as hard as he could and I dropped to the ground. I was dizzy and everything was foggy as I tried to get to my feet. I heard his car start and peel away. When I regained my focus, I noticed that he took that box of comics and documents. I called the police right away and gave them Pete's information, and that's when I realized Pete wasn't a friend at all. I never got his last name, mainly because I just never really thought about it or cared. I don't have social media, so I never even bothered to ask for his. We texted, but I didn't realize his phone was just some cheap track phone. The cops informed me that Pete most likely wasn't his name. Inside the box were a couple of credit cards that I owned as well, as I didn't bring them with me to work or anything like that. He used one to get gas, but that was the only time it was used before I was able to cancel it. The cops informed me that whoever Pete really was, he knew somehow that I had money. He got to know me and used our friendship to basically steal everything I had. Thankfully, he didn't get much from me, but he did get those comics that are worth in the thousands, and they do mean more to me sentimentally than the money. To this day, I have no idea who Pete was and where my comics ever went. I was able to get one of my comics back only a week after this incident happened, though. He had sold it to some pawn shop, and the guy wasn't very nice about the entire situation. What was most horrific about this situation was that he told the pawn shop employee that his name was my name, and the pawn shop employee had to double take because he thought it was me when I went into the shop to try and actually look for the comic. Some people out there are truly scary and have very insidious intentions. It's scary to think about the people you consider close in your life and what they may think about you. I apologize in advance for how I may sound writing this, as I have yet to try and put this into text. I'm looking for just general advice, I suppose. First, I must preface this by saying I currently live with my girlfriend, and I do love her. However, I fear that my girlfriend is not the same woman anymore. We've been together for nearly 10 years, and we started dating in our senior year of high school and have been together ever since. We both went away to separate colleges and stayed together that entire time. After graduating, we moved in together and have been happy until recently. I know what most people will assume because I have brought my concerns to friends who all say the same thing or versions of the same things. Most say things like, "She's probably with somebody else," "She's doing drugs," or my personal favorite, "She just doesn't love you anymore, man." If it were any of those, at least I would have clarification, but I assure you it's not. She's different now, like she's hiding something, but not someone else. It's almost as if though she's hiding something much darker, and I'll start at the beginning to try to remember as much as possible. Recently, I got home from work earlier than usual. Coming home early is not something that's rare for me, as my job has somewhat irregular hours. When I got home, she was in the shower. She didn't hear me come inside, but I heard her as soon as I got close to the bathroom. She was grunting and sounded angry. She kept yelling a series of curse words and continued to sound angry and upset about something. I knocked on the door to ask if she was all right, and the cursing stopped right away. She took a moment to respond and then said everything was okay. When she got out of the shower, which took a very long time I may add, she looked anxious and extremely tense. I asked one more time if she was okay, and sounding annoyed, she said yes and told me not to ask again. I backed off, figuring she just needed space for something. She's not the type of person to jump down anyone's throat. She's never short with me or anyone else, and after knowing her for almost 20 years and dating for almost 10, I can say with certainty that this was not her at all. The next morning I woke up for work and showered. When I got into the shower, I noticed that there was something on the ledge where we kept the soap bottles. It kind of looked like dried blood. I picked up the bottle and there was a red ring that formed under the bottle. I started to look at it a little closer and I noticed dried residue in several of the nooks and crannies around the shower area. I was curious, but not tense or worried or anything like that. That afternoon when I got home, one of her newer friends was over at the house. Kind of a strange woman named Shauna. I'll be honest, I don't like Shauna. I don't know exactly where they met. Maybe she was a coworker, maybe she was one of my girlfriend's customers. I don't know. All I know is that she just rubbed me the wrong way. She would talk constantly about getting into trouble when she was younger, and all the wild stuff she did when she was in her 20s. Shauna was most likely in her mid to late 30s if I had to guess. So that afternoon when I walked inside, my girlfriend and Shauna were acting weird. I noticed the laptop on the kitchen table, and when I got inside, they shut the laptop and seemed like they were trying to get me to leave the kitchen. I know something was wrong. I could see it on my girlfriend's face, but I didn't dare ask again. I went into the bedroom and shut the door so I could change from my work clothes. I could hear Shauna whispering something to my girlfriend and she sounded tense. Next thing I know, I heard a door slam, and when I went back out there, Shauna was pulling out of my driveway. My girlfriend is normally outgoing and bubbly as can be, but now she seemed more like a zombie or someone who hasn't slept in days. It became clear to me that she was hiding something. I truly didn't think that she was with someone else. It's not in her character. Ordinarily, I wouldn't snoop. We don't have that kind of relationship. But when I opened the laptop, her last page was still open. She was looking at weapons to purchase, and the website was not something I recognized. It looked shady as could be. Something to note about her, she's very anti-gun and anti-weapon in general, so to be on a page like this is extremely out of character. And this was what prompted me to look at the last few pages in the search history, and it was strange, to say the least. There were several news articles about people who were missing, and 2 web pages with directions to what appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. As the days passed, I noticed that she became more and more of a husk of her former self. No laughing, no smiles, no intimacy, no semblance of my girlfriend. I started to notice weird things like her shoes were extremely muddy, her phone was almost always turned off, and her computer mysteriously broke the day after I searched the history. I saw Shauna one more time a few days ago when I got home from work. Her car was outside running and it looked full of luggage. I walked inside and Shauna looked angry. She looked at me, then back at my girlfriend. She sighed, walked out of the house, and peeled off in her car. When she left, my girlfriend was as white as a ghost and sat on the couch, and I asked one last time if she was okay, and she said, "I will be soon. Shauna just... Well, it doesn't matter. I will be soon. I promise." I tried to unpack that statement a million times, and I still am not 100% sure what she meant. It is now a few days removed from when Shauna left, and my girlfriend is still not herself. My girlfriend is taking personal time off, so she hasn't left the house in days. My first thought was that maybe Shauna and her had something romantic together, but when I asked her about it, she denied it fiercely. After a couple of battles, she told me to leave it alone and stop asking, and the eyes that looked at me, I just barely recognized them anymore. I don't know what's happening, but my girlfriend, my best friend, is lost somewhere in her mind, and not the same woman I have loved for so long. If anybody reading this could please just give me some of your thoughts. I've done everything I can think of, and I'm worried that she may have done something horrible. If this story progresses anymore or I have any more news, I'll try to update you over email, let's read, and as of right now, I'm grasping at straws and praying that my girlfriend bounces back soon and that my worst thoughts are nothing more than dark fantasies plaguing my mind. I spent the early parts of my life on the wrong side of the law. I never finished school since I dropped out of high school in 11th grade, a decision that I always regretted. When I was 20 years old, I was arrested for the first time, and unfortunately, it would not be the last. During my entire 20s, I was in and out of jail. On my 30th birthday, I decided to make a change in my life. I realized that I had no friends and no direction. I tried different churches and clubs in my community to see if I could find my calling in life. During my search for meaning, I found Barry. He was exactly what I needed in life, especially at this point. I had met Barry at some church event. Barry said that he identified as agnostic, which I found strange being that it was a church event. But he said that he came to all the church events because of the community aspect. He claimed that all the people were outrageously friendly and there was no other place in the world to get this loving camaraderie. He was right about that. The people were so friendly at this place. I'm not good at religion, so I'm not even sure what kind of church this was. All I know is that the people were fantastic. Everybody loved Barry, even the church officials. Nobody cared about his stance on faith, they just loved him anyways. Barry was great to these people. He was constantly helping in any way he could, and he would donate clothes, food, and most importantly, his time. I'm not sure how Barry made his money, but he had a lot of it and used it for good. He would constantly give to the poor and encourage everyone to come to the events at the church. He would serve food to the less fortunate on the front lines. He would drive to very low-income areas of the city and help in any way that he could. Barry was, by all accounts, an amazing human being. In my search for meaning, obviously, I gravitated right to Barry. With no judgment in his character, Barry took me under his wing and I kind of became his partner. I helped with everything that Barry did in the community. It seemed like being with him almost cleared my name. Nobody cared who I was in the past, they only cared about me in the present. This life continued for a couple of years for me. Barry became more than a partner and, in fact, became an actual friend. When I had nowhere to live, Barry let me move into a small guest house. We'd wake up early, start our day, and just make our rounds in the city doing whatever we could, and Barry funded everything. This guy seemed to have an endless supply of money, and I never questioned it. One afternoon, when we were doing some charity event, I noticed for the first time that Barry wasn't himself. This guy was always energetic and excited about life, but he seemed quiet, almost like he was on another planet. That night, we were heading back to his house, and I asked if he was all right, and all he did was take a deep breath, sigh, and just said he was fine. Clearly, something was wrong. That night, I looked out the windows of the guest house that sat just behind Barry's house. His lights were on, and the blinds were open, so I could clearly see inside of his house. The guest house sat probably 50 feet or so from the house, so even though I could clearly see in the house, I was still far enough away that I couldn't tell if he was okay. Maybe I just had a bad feeling, but I think my life of crime just gave me insight into when people are just going to break. I hit my breaking point a lot in life. It's what got me in trouble most of the time, and it just seemed like Barry was at that point today. I thought about it for a while, but I eventually decided to go check on him just to make sure that he was okay. The guy gave me so much, and I figured I at least owed him this. I made my way through the yard that separated the guest house and his house. When I got close to the house, I could hear yelling. It was Barry, and he was screaming. I started to sneak toward the house now to eavesdrop, I admit that. I got close enough to be able to hear him clearly. He must have been on the phone because I could only hear him and not anybody else. He sounded so rageful and angry, and I never heard him raise his voice before, and now he was screaming, swearing, saying things I still can't believe came out of his mouth. I sneaked to the side of the house so I could peer into one of the windows. I saw Barry, frantically pacing around the house, and he was indeed on the phone. I heard him clearly say, "I don't care. If you don't get this done, I'll find someone else who can. I don't deal with this crap day in and day out for no reason. Get this done immediately so I can finally get out of this hell." That's exactly what he said. Obviously, I have no idea what he meant by all of that in the moment. He hung up the phone and threw it at the wall as he continued to scream. With no notice, he turned and saw me looking through the window. I dove out of the way, but I was sure he saw me. I laid on the side of his house and hoped that I didn't hear the door open. The hope only lasted a moment because the front door whipped open and I heard Barry screaming my name. I rose to my feet, embarrassed that I got caught snooping. Part of me figured that he would be okay because he was always so calm and patient with me, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The large middle-aged man grabbed the collar of my flannel and pushed me against the house. He started screaming so loud into my face I could feel the spit hitting my cheek. "After everything I did for you, I find you out here spying on my personal business." I was quiet. I didn't know what to say to him. I wanted to tell him that I was only over there to make sure he was all right, but I couldn't get the words out. He threw me to the ground and again shouted at me saying, "It was you, wasn't it? You're the one trying to get my money." I started to defend myself, claiming that I had no idea what he was talking about, which was true. When I started to get to my feet, he pushed me down again and kicked me in the face and yelled, "Stay here." Then he stormed back inside, slamming the door on his way in. The kick rocked me. I was dazed and saw stars in front of my eyes for a moment. I regained my focus and got to my feet again. I looked in the window and he was rummaging through a chest that he had in the room. He seemed to be grabbing something, but I wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded heavy. I ran back to the guest house, not wanting to take any chances. I grabbed a couple of personal items and ran into the woods that lined his property. I hid in the tree line and saw Barry wandering around the guest house and then eventually breaking down the door. He continued screaming my name and shouting for me to stop hiding, and he was indeed carrying something, but like before, I couldn't exactly tell what it was. It was long and narrow, and he was using it to knock back the doors. Finally, he reached the tree line. I was quietly making my way down the wooded area. Thankfully, he was shouting, so he couldn't hear me shuffling through the trees. I eventually made it to the road and ran as fast as I could as far as I could. I'd look back every few minutes but never saw him following me. When I got to a local convenience store, I asked if the store could please call the police for me, as I didn't have a cell phone at the time. When they showed up, I told them everything. I didn't really know if there was anything they could do, but I figured since Barry technically attacked me and then chased me, I did feel as if though I was in danger. The police showed up at his house, and the next thing I knew, he was arrested. I don't know what he was arrested for, as I was never informed for some reason, but when I googled his name, nothing comes up, which leads me to believe that Barry was actually a fake name. I spent years with this guy and even lived just a few yards from his house, and he never once led me to believe that he was hiding anything or even had a violent bone in his body. Whatever secret he had, it finally collapsed on him. I have no idea if he intended on harming me more that evening, but the beating I received outside his house convinced me otherwise. Does anybody out there have any idea what Barry could have been doing or what he could have been hiding? I just want answers. Sometimes it's the best people that are hiding the darkest secrets. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. It's funny how in life some friends can come and go. What's not so funny is the way some of the friends go. A couple of years ago, my best friend Dee decided to have her bachelorette party in Nashville, Tennessee. The prospect of spending an entire weekend in Nashville was exciting, to say the least. The group of us contained 7 girls, and that included the soon-to-be bride. We all pitched in and rented an awesome house for the long weekend that was just a several-minute trip to where all the happening nightlife takes place. A trip to Nashville isn't just an hour down the road for us, so it required some planning to make it a reality for Dee. As a result of the months-long planning process, I ended up getting much closer to some of the girls that were going to be at the wedding. One of the girls could be described as outgoing, if I'm being nice, but more realistically, she was abrasive and in your face. Truth be told, I ended up becoming really close to her during this time. Her name was Megan, and it started off just meeting for drinks and planning the trip. That soon evolved into real plans of hanging out and talking about more than just Dee's wedding. Megan was a wild spirit. We'd go out drinking, and she was the girl who would try and get on top of the bar and dance. She almost always left with a guy or a girl, and was always ready to go back out the next day. For a while, I admired her spirit and just the overall tenacious attitude in life. I was looking forward to partying with her in Nashville. It was surely going to be a treat, and oh boy, was I wrong. By the time the Nashville trip came, I was already becoming wary of Megan, as horrible as that may sound. Someone I considered an acquaintance and then a good friend, I was starting to have second thoughts about her. When we were in Nashville, I hated to admit that my gut was right. Megan was off the wall, and not in a good way. She got up on the bar and tried to dance again, just as she's done many times in our hometown, but she fell off the bar and cracked her head open. She was all right, didn't seem to be hurt, but it was embarrassing, and we were asked to leave the bar. She tried to fight several of the other bridesmaids, as well as patrons of the many bars we went to. Dee was so embarrassed, and she wanted to go back to the house that we were renting and stay in so we wouldn't get in any more trouble. Megan was not a fan of that idea, stating over and over again that we were in Nashville to party. If we wanted to have a house party, we should have just stayed home. Being the maid of honor, I tried to tell Megan that it was about whatever Dee wanted and not us. Well, Megan didn't seem to care. She basically told us that we were lame and that she was going to stay and party at the bar. Dee was furious and told us to leave her there and that we were going back to the house. I told Megan to call me when she needed a ride, and I would make sure that she got back to the house one way or another. She was a bit dismissive but nodded and then went back to the bar. We drank and played Wii Sports at the house that we rented. Believe it or not, this was one of the highlights of the trip for me. It was relaxing and fun, and we all just had a good time. I'd forgotten all about Megan until about 4 a.m. I got out of bed and checked my phone. I had one message from Megan at 2:30 in the morning. It was a picture message of her giving the finger to the camera with a group of 3 girls, and one guy all giving the camera the same gesture. Though that may seem alarming to some who may read this, I assure you this is a typical Megan message. I called her, and the call went right to voicemail. I texted several more times and got no response. I walked around the entire house to make sure that she wasn't sleeping in any of the rooms, and to my horror, she was not. I didn't know what to do, honestly. At around 6 in the morning, I woke up some of the girls and asked them what they think we should do. Because Megan was horrible to some of the girls earlier in the night, the girls basically said to just leave her and good riddance. Though a part of me may have felt that we couldn't leave her. After all, something could have happened to her, and at the end of the day, she is still one of Dee's friends. When Dee finally woke up, there was still no sign of Megan. Dee is a bit of an anxious human, so she became erratic right away. Our flight was later on that afternoon, and we needed to get ready to head to the airport. We finally decided after a long back and forth that the best course of action would be to call the police and figure out what to do. Right before calling the authorities, Megan finally called us. She sounded messed up, like maybe she was drunk or something. She yelled at all of us, telling us that we were horrible friends and we deserved to rot in hell. She specifically singled me out, which I still don't understand to this day. We begged and pleaded with her to get back to the airport because we needed to leave, and she basically told us to screw off and that she could get home just fine without us. After dropping several expletives, her final word to us in verbatim was, "Just leave me in Nashville. Bye." Dee tried the entire afternoon to get Megan to the airport, but no response. She turned off her location and just blocked us all, and we had no idea where to find her. We boarded the plane and just left Megan in Nashville. Days passed, and I went about my life without thinking about Megan. I eventually spoke to Dee several times about it, and she told me that she hadn't heard from Megan either. She had no family here, so we really didn't know how to get in touch with anyone to make sure that she was all right. We looked her up online, found nothing. We even went as far as to look at missing people and even deaths, but thankfully nothing. We decided that wherever Megan is, whatever she's doing, she doesn't want to be found, and hopefully she's safe. And that was several years ago. But just last week, though, I had my first encounter with Megan, and it didn't go well. On Friday after work, I get home and decided to stay in for the evening. It had been a long week, and I was ready to just lay low and drink a glass of wine. My boyfriend was out of town for business, and I was going to be alone. Shortly after midnight, I decided to get ready for bed. I called my boyfriend to say goodnight. I decided to FaceTime him while I was brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed. I had my phone propped up on top of a little cabinet that I had in my bathroom. From where the phone was propped up, he could see out the doorway and into my bedroom. My boyfriend was in mid-sentence telling me a story when he just stopped. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "Is someone else there?" I laughed and grabbed the phone. I asked what he was talking about, and he said that in the background he saw the closet door open slightly. I was freaked out, but for sure thought that he was messing with me. I looked back down at the phone, and he was visibly shaken, which isn't like him. He texted me while we were on FaceTime and told me to get out of the apartment now, claiming that he could absolutely see someone moving in the closet. I tried not to be obvious and make my way to the kitchen. While I was putting my shoes on, I looked at the doorway to my bedroom, and standing in the doorway was none other than Megan. She looked insane and ready to attack. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, and she stared back at me, and in an almost sinister voice she said, "You left me in Nashville." I put my hands up to reason with her. At the same time, my boyfriend was still on the phone, and he had his roommate in the hotel room call the authorities to send someone to my house. Before I could say any words, Megan said it again, and this time with more ferocity in her voice. "You left me in Nashville." Flight mode kicked in, and I decided to run as fast as I could out the door. Megan chased after me as she continued to yell that same phrase repeatedly. I was sprinting, and Megan was close behind, not at all letting up her chase. Before long, I could see the lights of a cop car. I flagged them down in desperation, and it was as if Megan didn't care. The cop got out of the car, and Megan tackled me in front of the police officer. The cop apprehended her immediately and she became frantic, screaming and making noises I still can't even understand. They arrested Megan, who was carrying a knife concealed inside of her sweatshirt. What she intended on doing with that knife, I still don't know. This is all so fresh and I don't really know what I'm doing. I've hired a lawyer and I'm trying to figure out what even happened. It seems like Megan is some shell of herself, as if the real Megan isn't even in there anymore. I've never had a friend that has come into my life so fast and left even faster. I reflect on everything that happened in Nashville and how we all reacted, and I'm sure leaving her that night had much to do with the eventual collapse of her sanity. I blame myself for what happened, even though many have told me not to. I hope she recovers someday, and anybody who can offer any guidance on my situation as to how I should handle this is greatly appreciated. Just be kind to everyone, because you never know who might be hurting on the inside. I'm sure most people who read this can understand what I'm saying when I say, I wish I would have listened to the warnings about a certain romantic partner. We have all had horrible exes, I'm sure, but mine could have ended my life permanently. When I first met Wyatt, everything was like a dream. He seemed like the guy who presented his life as an open book. He was charming and witty, and he was wildly handsome. Tall, had an athletic build, the right amount of scruff, and had the most beautiful white teeth that he always presented when he smiled. I know we all have different things that attract us, but he was, objectively speaking, very handsome. Whenever people met Wyatt, they instantly fell in love with the guy. He just had one of those extremely likable personalities where he could get along with really anybody. Wyatt and I went out on a few dates, but nothing flourished right away. Everything that I just mentioned, I loved about the guy, but I just didn't feel a special connection. We talked about it and Wyatt understood, and there were no hard feelings. We stayed friends and went our separate ways when it came to dating. We started to get really close as friends over the next few months. We would tell each other about our love life, or lack thereof in my case, and offer advice. He became someone in my life that I treasured. His friendship was more important to me than any of my other friends at this point in my life. A couple of years passed, and Wyatt eventually started seeing this girl and then deleted all of his social media, and he mostly stopped talking to me. I didn't take it too personally because by this point, he and I didn't really talk nearly as much. Shortly after that, I stopped seeing Wyatt around. Even though he and I drifted apart a little bit, we would still see each other out at the bars, but lately no Wyatt. The number I had for him was no longer in service, and he still never had any social media. One night, a group of people at the bar started to talk about Wyatt. I was informed by these people that his breakup with the girl that he was seeing went horrible, and he ended up moving away to restart his life. I felt bad for the guy and honestly felt a little upset that he didn't talk to me about any of this. I know we had somewhat drifted apart, but I would have been there for him in a second if he had called. Life went on after this night, and I soon forgot about Wyatt until one night not so long ago. It was a Friday night, and I was at the local bar my friends and I always visit. It was like a scene out of a movie. Suddenly, the doors opened, and just as handsome as ever, Wyatt walked in. I stepped away from the group of people that I was with in mid-conversation and greeted him with the biggest hug ever. We talked all night about everything. It was like being with the old Wyatt before we drifted away. The one thing I noticed in hindsight was that he never got up to order a drink from the bar. I didn't notice it then, and I wish I had. That night he came over to my place, and for the first time in all the years I had known Wyatt, we kissed. That kiss eventually led to more dates, which led to me giving him a chance outside of the friend zone. I was recently single again and emotional, and I think he just had come back to town at the right time. Part of me felt like this was the right choice to give him a chance, but something deep down still told me to trust my initial gut about this guy. When we finally started dating, I noticed that he never wanted to go to the bar we always went to. I thought it was a weird request, but nothing to be sketched out about. Some people just don't like certain bars or restaurants. So for about a month, we never went to that bar. One night, my friends all begged for me to meet them at our usual bar, and I told Wyatt I wanted to go. He seemed nervous for some reason, but ultimately just said whatever. He said he didn't want to go, which was totally fine with me. I'm not one of those people to have to be with my boyfriend 24/7. I met my friend that evening at around 9:30 at the bar. Wyatt said he would pick me up at around midnight. When I ordered a drink, the bartender looked at me and her eyes lit up, and not in a good way. She tentatively took my order and then brought my drink back, not even remotely making eye contact with me. It was as if though I offended her in some way, but I couldn't think of anything I could have done. I shrugged it off and continued to hang out with my friends. Periodically, I would look over to the bar and notice this bartender staring at me. It was a little jarring, but I wasn't about to let it ruin my night. When it was almost midnight, I closed out my tab and decided to use the restroom before Wyatt picked me up. While I was washing my hands, the bartender walked in and locked the door. I thought I was about to get jumped or something. She had tears in her eyes and she said, "Gina, you're Gina, right?" I nodded and responded with a very hesitant yes. The bartender lowered her head and said, "Please tell me you're not dating him. If you are, you need to end it." Before letting her finish, I went right into defense mode. I figured she was jealous or some sort of ex-girlfriend or something along those lines. "Listen to me," she shouted. With nervousness and tension in her voice, she started to speak again. "I used to date Wyatt a couple of years ago. He would always compare me to you, say things like, 'Why can't you be more like Gina?' Or 'Gina would do it like this,' or my favorite, 'When I'm with Gina.' I grew to hate you. I didn't even know you. Then I found on his computer a folder that had hundreds, if not thousands of pictures of you. Those pictures of you were taken from all over the place. You driving, walking, pictures of you on dates, even pictures of you inside your house. I confronted Wyatt and he went nuts, deleted everything, threatened me and left town. I never saw him again until the other night when he walked into the bar. I knew you looked familiar to me, but I never put the pieces together until I saw Wyatt." My heart was racing at this point. I didn't know if I should believe her or if this was an exaggeration. I asked why she didn't contact the police, and she couldn't give me a straight answer. I started to feel like she may have just been a little jealous and I didn't believe her story. It just didn't seem like Wyatt. I thanked her for warning me and asked her to let me out of the bathroom. She unlocked the door and just stood there with her head down. At the time, I remember thinking to myself, if it is fake, this bartender is doing a great job looking scared. She was trembling and white as a ghost. A little after midnight, Wyatt pulled up and I got into his car. We started to drive back to his place and I felt comfortable enough with him to bring up the story that the bartender told me. After repeating the story to him, he was quiet for a second, like he was trying to find the words to say. Finally, instead of denying it, all he said was, "I just loved you so much, Gina." I looked back at Wyatt, who had his eyes on the road, and said, "Whoa, dude, are you telling me that story's true? You took all those photos of me?" He didn't respond with words. Instead, he just started to drive faster. I looked over and our speed was climbing. 75, 80, 85. And before I knew it, he was driving well over 100 miles per hour. I was frantic and screaming for him to stop the car. The stretch of highway we were on had a slight turn coming up, and when he hit the turn, he drove straight. And we went sailing right through the guardrail. The windshield shattered, and we rolled down a massive hill. I truly believe the reason I didn't die was because of that hill, as we eventually lost momentum as we continued to roll. I blacked out for a second, and when I came to, Wyatt was unconscious behind the wheel. I was bleeding from my head, but I was coherent, and I didn't feel like I had a concussion somehow. I grabbed my phone and called 911, who showed up extremely fast. They were able to treat my injuries, and as they pulled Wyatt out of the car, he finally started to come to. He was extremely groggy and taken to the hospital. I, however, told the police everything that happened that evening, how my boyfriend had purposely driven off the road going way over the speed limit. I did tell them about the pictures, but they didn't seem to do anything about it, at least I don't think they did. He was charged for the driving incident, and you better believe I pressed charges. I don't know if this guy intended on killing us both or if he just truly went insane in that moment. I've known Wyatt for a long time, and I would never have any idea that he was capable of such horrors. I'm lucky to be alive, and I should have listened to the warning about him when the bartender told me. Thank God he's in jail, and I'm working with someone now to see what can be done about the alleged pictures he's taken of me. If that is true, that might be a serious crime to add on top of what else he did, and Wyatt might be locked up for his foreseeable future. One of the best things about your family owning a bar is that one day you get to inherit that bar. For many years, I assisted my father in running the bar. I bartended, worked in the kitchen, and helped with paperwork when I can. A couple of days ago, my old man unfortunately passed away, making me the sole owner of the business. One of the patrons, an older gentleman named Boris, was deeply saddened about the news of my father. The man was sobbing, which was an interesting sight for me. I've been working in this bar for over 20 years, and I've known Boris that entire time, and I'd never seen him get like this. Boris was a bigger man. He had a faint accent of some kind, but I'm not good with accents, so I have no idea where he's from. Over the years, I would consider Boris to be a friend. Other than my family, he's the longest relationship I've had. I know that Boris and my dad knew each other before he opened the bar, but I never got the story as to how they knew each other. For years, he would sit at the bar and talk to Boris. He was your typical dive bar regular. He rocked a full white beard and had solid white hair that was pulled back into a ponytail. He always wore brown, like he didn't own any other clothes of different colors. He always had some wild stories to tell, and they were always entertaining. So to see Boris so torn up really hit me hard. I gave him several drinks on the house in memory of my old man. That night when I closed the bar, Boris was still sitting there, in no condition to drive. I looked at the mentally wounded man and said, "All right, my friend, you're not driving tonight, I'll take you home." I knew where he lived because I've had to take him home countless times before. He lived 2 minutes away, and that's if he caught all the lights. I did all my cleaning and started to shut off the lights. "Come on, Boris, we're leaving," I shouted one last time, but he didn't budge. I sat down next to the man and put my arm around him to try and console him, and I still am shocked and slightly terrified about what happened. In a weak voice, Boris finally spoke up and said, "I'm not the man you think I am. When you get older like me, death makes you think." I just nodded and rubbed his shoulder a bit. I didn't know what to say. Boris then took his gigantic hand and slammed the counter of the bar. He looked at me in tears and said, "I've done things you wouldn't imagine. There were few ways to make a living where I came from. It was the only way I could escape, and I liked it. I liked what I did. I never knew I would feel like this, though. Never." Boris was drunk and clearly not in a stable mind. "Okay, buddy, let's just get you out of here. You sound like you need some rest," I said calmly as I stood up. Boris stood up swiftly, which was impressive for a man his age and under his current condition. The giant man made me look like a child next to him. He grabbed the collar of my shirt and started to jostle me around like a rag doll, and now screaming with pain in his voice, "You don't understand. I've done things. I'm not a good man. I still see the faces. Every night I see the faces." My heart was nearly beating out of my chest. He started to back me into a corner. I wasn't even processing his words at that moment. I was preoccupied with how I was going to neutralize the situation. Just as my back was fully against the wall, he turned around and sat back on one of the stools at the bar. He started to sob again. "You think you know me? Your father, he knew. He's gone now, just like everybody else." Boris started screaming and yelling. No words I understood, it clearly was some other language. He became even more irate, throwing the stools and flipping tables. My keys and phone were still behind the bar, and I sat like some coward in the corner while this giant man lost his poor mind. Finally, he turned to me one last time and said, "The faces won't haunt me anymore. I won't let them." Then he ran out of the bar, faster than anyone had ever seen move at that age. I just sat paralyzed on the ground for several minutes trying to process everything that had just happened. Once I finally calmed down, I got up to chase after him, but when I ran outside, he was completely out of sight. I grabbed my keys and started to drive up and down the road, and he was nowhere to be found. I couldn't imagine a man his age could have gotten very far, but the roads were empty. I drove to his house and knocked on the door, but no answer. At this time, I finally called the police and reported everything to them that I just laid out here. And Boris never went home that evening, and believe it or not, he's still missing. No trace of his body or him anywhere. His car is at his house, and he's not there. And he has no family that the police or I could identify, and nothing in his home indicated where he could have gone. And as of writing this, he's still out there somewhere, and honestly, I just hope he's okay. I have talked to that man millions of times, someone I have told countless personal stories to, someone I genuinely care about, had completely snapped. Something he had buried deep down with him finally escaped, and whatever memories he had became too much for him to sustain. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you touch my Funko Pop, you die.